Hi, good morning. So, as promised, I wanted to post a little video on the introductory readings that we've done so far, primarily John Dewey, and also the context provided by Kliebard. So many of you pointed out in your reaction paper 1 some connections that you see with John Dewey and what we would today call child-centered curriculum, or student-centered learning, different ways to say the same thing. And you rightly connected those ideas to him. One thing to remember, of course, is that John Dewey is writing over 100 years ago. And very often what my students come up with is this kind of amazement that these ideas that in many ways we still fight for today were brought up over 100 years ago. And even to the point that some students often kind of comment, why didn't we do what Dewey said? Why didn't we do it? And so it's an interesting kind of dilemma. I would also point out too that John Dewey's theory of education and theory of learning, when he was writing, was considered philosophy. And actually, when it was taught to me, the first time I was sitting in your seat in a master's degree program many years ago now, it was taught to me as philosophy. What's interesting is that since the 1990s, there's been so much advancement in neuroscience, which of course is the science of understanding how the brain actually functions, the biology of it, actually the chemistry of it. And we know more now than we've ever known, although anybody who actually does that scientific work will tell you that we just know the tip of the iceberg. Be very cautious of professional development or even educational leaders who talk about brain-based education or brain-based research that overstate the claims. Anybody who's very serious about that kind of work will tell you that we have only scratched the surface. There's so much we still don't know about the brain and how it works. But I find it very interesting that you could lay out John Dewey's theory of education, the role of experience, the role of connecting new ideas to existing ideas. For him was philosophy. For us now is really backed up by the neuroscience. We know that there's actually connections being made in the brain that is a physical change. Your brain looks different when you learn something, right? And that is fascinating and edifying to me. So it doesn't surprise me that you see these connections. But it is interesting to see how there is still a struggle for this, right? Now that struggle is what he decided to sit down and write that became known as The Child in the Curriculum. What Dewey was writing about was a fight, right? It was an argument between different scholars and educational leaders and what they thought was important. There's a reason I came back to the Spencer slide here on our PowerPoint. What knowledge is of most worth? That's the curriculum question, right? We have to make those decisions. Well, Dewey is talking about a fight that's happening, again, over 100 years ago, between scholars, some who said it's the child that's most important, and others that said it's the curriculum that's the most important. And curriculum here means the formal curriculum. So this is where I'm hoping that you can really see the connections between the Kliebard reading and John Dewey. Kliebard gives you the history, the context of that fight, and then Dewey just kind of takes it on, right? As, again, he's a philosopher, so as a philosophical challenge, how to solve this kind of dilemma. Not a lot of you did that work in research in reaction paper 1. That's more of what I was looking for, but I think we can get there. And I think as the discussion forum has progressed, I've seen more and more of that connection as well. So remember that Kliebard is really making a case that the struggle, it's the title of the book, right? The struggle for the American curriculum is about 4 different threads, or he likes to think of them as different currents in a river, and that at some point one rises to the top and becomes dominant, and then another one, they might slip down and another one rises to the top. So his argument is that these currents are still in how we think about curriculum, never completely resolved, but they're always kind of there. So in the child versus the curriculum, those that argue, look, these are the things that students have to learn, Kliebard refers to them as the humanists, right? So the humanists are the ones who say, look, it's got to be literature, geography, mathematics, science. They are very interested in listing the things. What is it, right? And they tie this to these interesting antiquated ideas like the furniture of the mind, you might remember, right? So they're way more interested in what the it is, right? What the it is. That's the focus on the formal curriculum. That's something you see today too, right? We see it all the time. And frankly, I think we see it in rather silly things like, late night comics, in the talk shows have the man on the street thing where they go out and ask Americans, what's the Fourth Amendment say, or what's the capital of this state, or who wrote the Declaration of Independence? And the big joke, of course, is that Americans don't know it. I think it's kind of a mean-spirited comedy, but the idea is that there are things that we should know, right, and that we don't. Or, for example, interestingly, perhaps today, after the 2008 financial crash, suddenly there was this push for financial literacy. We've got to get financial literacy into the curriculum because Americans need to know, more about how the finance system works in case something like this catastrophe happens again. So we see curricular responses to current events and certainly political ideology, etc. So that, according to Kliebard, that would be very much of a humanist kind of perspective. Now the other, at the time when Dewey was writing, was the child. And this was a rather new, radical position in what was becoming, the new but really important field of study called psychology. It's important to know there was no such thing called psychology, right? Really before the mid to late 1800s, right? And so the idea of psychology, particularly child psychology, is that the child's brain works differently, right? And that it's developmental. These are terms that we know as educators all the time, developmentally appropriate. That was crazy talk, right, 100 years ago, right? Folks did not understand that or apply that. And so the idea was we have to think about the developmental processes of the child if we're going to reach that child. And then Dewey offers a set of theories with some other folks. Piaget is a name that you know. You may know William James, one of the founding faculty of Johns Hopkins University, by the way. There's some folks that were thinking about, well, how does learning work? And they see these connections between what's already known and something new. John Dewey calls this a schema, right? That's a word you probably heard in your education courses somewhere along the way, right? That actually what's happening is a connection between something that's already learned. And if you don't access that connection, you run the risk of missing the mark completely. Which is, someone did write in the reaction paper about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Always loved that term. You may have remembered it. But what that zone of proximal development is the idea of presenting something that's outside the range where a learner can make the connection. And we do it all the time, right? So, and then learning doesn't happen. So the idea then is, how do we, and this is another kind of Piaget term, how do we scaffold learning experiences so that learners can walk in with what they've got and come out with something new? So what I'm really trying to show you here is that John Dewey, from a philosophical perspective, starts to think about this in a curricular sense, right? Now, where we end up with John Dewey, right, is rather interesting, in the sense that he says, well, here's this fight, and it's a fight between the child and the curriculum. These two camps are fighting it out, right? See who can be more powerful, who can be more influential. And John Dewey says, whoa, 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 that's the wrong question, right? If you're focused on learning, then the child and the curriculum are parts of a continuum, right? They're parts of a continuum. They're connected. You can't teach that really important curriculum that you've settled upon if you're not paying attention to the child, right? And if you're only paying attention to the child without thinking about the formal curriculum or the what of learning, then what are you doing? You're just letting the child do whatever they want. They're learning stuff, but it wouldn't be what we call public education. You see how those are connected? John Dewey really says you're asking the wrong question. It's not the child or the curriculum. It's the balance between the two. How does that continuum work? So a common misconception, right, is that John Dewey and those that follow student-centered instruction, child-centered learning, however we want to call it, say you let the kids do whatever they want, right? And it's just let them do what they want to do, right? That's not what John Dewey says by a long shot. So the example I always give is, like, let's say you got a group of second graders, right? And this year they're super interested in dinosaurs. They're all about dinosaurs this year, right? Last year it was rocket ships, right? This year it's dinosaurs, right? Or whatever it is, but let's say it's dinosaurs this year. So what does that mean? Does that mean you only let them learn about dinosaurs and explore those ideas? No. John Dewey says you use that interest in dinosaurs in order to get them to those larger curriculum goals that have already been decided by the larger community, right? And that we use dinosaurs to teach these other things, or to be kind of, abstract. We use dinosaurs to teach math, multiplication and division, whatever that thing is, right? Does that make sense? We use the students' interest to get to where we want to go. Now, how do we decide those larger formal curriculum things? That's another question. But don't make that mistake. And you hear it sometimes out there, like, oh, the child-centered people, all they want to let kids just do whatever they want. It's not what John Dewey says. It's not what Piaget says, right? It's not what the early curriculum thinkers think at all. But you do pay attention. What are those students interested in? Because that means they've already got it. Right? They've got some ideas in their head. How do you connect those ideas to something more formal, more connected? So again, Dewey's saying you're asking the wrong questions. Right? So again, I'm hopeful that what Kliebard gives us is this context for that argument itself. I know there's a lot of names in there and there's a lot of history in there, but that book is really considered a classic, right, in the history of curriculum. And I feel like old social studies teacher here, that we kind of have to begin with the history to understand how that context plays out and how ideas develop. So again, Kliebard, for our purposes, one talks about the humanists. They're the ones interested in that formal curriculum, right? Then he talks about the child developmentalist, and that's that new psychology group that's thinking about, how does learning work? How does a child develop? How can we think about education as one in which both the teacher, the student, and the curriculum are all in relation, right? That learning is this active, fluid thing that happens, right? Then, of course, he talks about the social efficiency folks. We get to that eventually. And that argument is very much that society is what it is. And so then what the curriculum needs to reflect is a way to put people into those spots in curriculum in an efficient manner. And then there's the social meliorists, or what we talked about in lecture 1 as the social reconstructionists. And so to ameliorate is to fix something. So the social meliorists are the ones who say education has got to be our engine to fix the problems of the social world. So for Kliebard, those are the 4 big streams that are moving through this river of American education. It seems to me kind of like the philosophies of education that we talked about in lecture 1, that we can see evidence of these 4 streams still in education today. It depends on, kind of the argument that we're having. But the struggle that we're still having on what's the best way to provide this thing called public education, it isn't new. It's rooted in a history. I hope that's coming across. Now, to take a turn, we read 2 new things, right? The George Kuntz Dare the Schools Build the Challenge the Social Order, and Carter G. Woodson from The Miseducation of a Negro. And it raises some different kinds of questions within those contexts. Kuntz is very clearly a social meliorist, right? And he's making an argument that teachers have way more power than they typically take up. He's talking to you, right? And he says if educators took that power, then really schools could be that engine for social change. Kind of a revolutionary call. It was radical then, it's radical now. Interestingly, we're seeing, if you follow the national conversation, we're seeing teachers go on strike, we're seeing organizing, we're seeing there's an attention being paid to school boards and school board elections that we've never seen before. And I'm talking about both sides of the political aisle. I'm talking about different ideologies as well. There's an increased politicization of the education profession that also has some historical roots. And then, of course, we've got Woodson with a really powerful text. And one of the questions that I asked you to consider is, well, why is it that we don't know about Woodson? I'm willing to bet that most of you have never read The Miseducation of the Negro. I'm willing to bet. You might have known that he started Black History Month, right? But did you know that he did this kind of work on curriculum, right? Did you know that Lauryn Hill's record is basically a play on Carter G. Woodson? You should have. So how do we think about race within these contexts, right? How do we think about that bitter history, not just of slavery, but of Jim Crow post-history, and at how education plays a role in that, right? And you've got some brilliant thinkers that are taking these questions on, and yet we've avoided them, right? So even those of us, that have education degrees, what does it mean that we've never read Carter G. Woodson? What does it mean that, I've already told you, Kliebard is a classic, right, in terms of history of curriculum, and he doesn't mention that work. And of course, Woodson's not alone. There's other scholars, there's particularly Black women scholars that are almost completely ignored, like Anna Julia Cooper, right, or Mary McLeod Bethune, right? These are women who were educating in the Black community and writing about it and making really generous offerings about what curriculum should look like given those horrible contexts. And again, it's almost completely cut out, right, of how we think about this history. So now we're going to take on some more challenging questions, right? Kliebard, we're going to continue to read because it's going to continue to give us this context. I want you to think about Dewey too, kind of as a framing way to think about this moving forward. But part of what I'm trying to do is really kind of expand this notion in your head of what curriculum is. And then what curriculum theorizing could be, what curriculum studies could be, right? And kind of break these bounds that we have on ourselves. Okay, I'm looking forward to some new questions. I'm looking forward to seeing your annotated bibliographies and where we are there, and continuing on in the class. Again, I really hope you're taking care of yourselves and your communities. I hope you're paying attention to what the CDC and Governor Hogan, in our case, is suggesting. And please do take those things seriously. And don't be afraid to reach out. And we'll keep this train moving. Thanks so much, and take care.